The junction between the two neurons is called synapse. The point where the two neurons meet. For the wire, because we always compare it with the
Mm.
wires must always be connected head to head for the current to flow. But
Okay.
for neurons, there is always a gap. The two neurons where they connect, there is a gap in between them. This junction is called synapse, but the gap between them is called the synaptic cleft. Okay, this is where the electrical impulse that is traveling in the neuron converts into chemical impulse. Okay,
Okay.
so neurons are supposed to send the messages in the form of electrical impulses to and from the central nervous system. So they
Okay.
send the messages to the central nervous system. Like, for example, your sensory neuron, when you touch something, you're able to feel it. I touch this pencil, I'm able to feel that I'm touching the pencil. How am I able to feel it? Because the electrical impulses, can you turn off your mic? So I would be on the screen for the recording. Yes, thank you. Okay, so when I am touching something, I'm able to feel it because there are sensory neurons present in my under my skin. There are receptors that would receive this stimulus. A stimulus is a change that can be detected by your body. So this is something that my body can detect. This is a stimulus. Touching something is a stimulus. I can feel it because I have receptors under my skin. There are thermoreceptors, there are pressure receptors, there are pain receptors. You have receptors in your tongue, you have receptors in your eyes, you have receptors in your ears, like taste buds, hair cells, rods and cones in your eyes, olfactory cells in your nose, and under your skin you have many receptors like Pacinian corpuscles and Meissner's corpuscles, basically the touch receptor and the pressure receptor. So when you touch something, you're able to feel it because you have receptors under your skin. These receptors are stimulated, they feel the stimulus. Now receptors are transducers. That is one of the most important property of receptors. Let me go back to the notes where I can write. So you see the screen. Transducers. Receptors are transducers because when they receive the stimulus, they can convert whatever that stimulus is. For your skin, it could be touch or temperature. For your eyes, it is light. For your nose, it is chemicals in the air. For your tongue, it is chemicals in the food. For your ears, it is sound. Whatever the stimulus is, your receptors are able to convert it into electrical signals. The energy from the stimulus is converted into electricity. So they convert it into electrical impulses. That's why they are called transducers, because they convert the form of signals. The original stimulus could be something like pressure or light, but the receptors that receive that stimulus would convert it into electrical impulses. Now, these electrical impulses are transmitted to the central nervous system from the neurons. Neurons are supposed to conduct the electrical impulses. That's what the primary job of neuron is, to conduct electrical impulses. Now, this neuron, like the sensory neuron, would eventually send this message to the relay neuron, which is present within the central nervous system. There are three types of neurons. You have sensory neurons sending the message towards the brain, towards the central nervous system. There is relay neuron, which is present within the central nervous system. And there is motor neuron, which takes the message from the relay neuron to the effector. So from sensory, it goes, let me show you one image if I can. Let's look at this. You step on the pin accidentally, or maybe on purpose, I don't know. But you step on the pin, that's the stimulus. Your receptors that are present under the skin would be able to feel it and convert it into electrical impulses. This purple thing is the sensory neuron, which takes the electrical impulses to the central nervous system, in this case, spinal cord. Central nervous system means spinal cord or brain. So they take the message to the central nervous system, which is spinal cord in this case. This orange one, this one is the relay neuron or the intermediate neuron, which is present within the central nervous system. It takes the impulses from the sensory neuron and then communicates these impulses to the motor neuron. The green one is the motor neuron. This one is the sensory neuron. This one is the relay neuron. And the final one, which is the which is taking the message to the effector, is the motor neuron. This is the effector in this case. Effector is what responds to the stimulus. Your muscle or gland that responds. So effectors are either muscles or glands that respond to the stimulus. If you look at the complete pathway, this would be the complete pathway. There is a stimulus that is detected by the receptor. Receptor converts it into electrical impulses because receptors are transducers. They communicate the message through the sensory neuron to the central nervous system. Within the central nervous system, you have relay neuron, which takes the input of the central nervous system and communicates it to the motor neuron. The motor neuron then takes the message to the effector, and effector then responds accordingly. This is the complete pathway. Now, let's see how these neurons, okay, this part. When the sensory neuron meets the relay neuron within the central nervous system, they're not connected head to head. So how is the message conveyed from the sensory neuron to the relay neuron if they're not connected? What happens is, now this is a sequence that you would have to remember. When the sensory neuron, which is conducting the electrical impulse, and this electrical impulse reaches the end of the sensory neuron. This is the end of the sensory neuron. This is before the synapse, so I'm going to call it the presynaptic neuron, and this membrane would be referred to as the presynaptic membrane. This is after the synapse, so it is called the postsynaptic neuron, and this membrane would be called the postsynaptic membrane. Now, the magic. As the sensory neuron, which is conducting the impulse reaches the end of the neuron, it actually stimulates the calcium channels to open. Now, this is from where the sequence starts. The steps, this is the first step. As the impulse reaches the end of the sensory neuron, the calcium channels would open. That would cause calcium ions to get in. The calcium ions would move into the neuron is a cell. Remember that. So neuron is a cell. There are many calcium ions outside. There are few calcium ions inside. So, but the calcium ions is not supposed to get in through the membrane because membrane is partially permeable. It does not allow the calcium ions to get in. But when the channels open, calcium ions, which were dying to get in because there were many calcium ions outside, they were dying to get in through down the gradient. As the channels open, there would be an influx of calcium ions inside. Many calcium ions would get into the neuron. As the calcium ions get in, they would cause these vesicles. Now, in the presynaptic neuron, at the end, just before the presynaptic membrane, there are these special vesicles. Do you see the vesicles? These vesicles are basically membranes enclosing a special chemical which is called neurotransmitter. There could be different neurotransmitters in your body, but the one that we are studying about, this is actually acetylcholine. This particular chemical or neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine. Amna, I need you to focus. Now, acetylcholine, look at the screen. Yes. As the calcium ions get in, when the channels open, which were stimulated by the electrical impulse, the channels open, calcium ions get in. Calcium ions stimulate these vesicles to move towards the presynaptic membrane. These vesicles would fuse with the presynaptic membrane, and there are special proteins that would help the vesicles to merge or to fuse with the membrane. These proteins are called snare proteins. Snare proteins helps in merging membranes. The vesicle and the presynaptic membrane would merge, would fuse. Snare proteins would facilitate that process. As the vesicles fuse with the membrane, presynaptic membrane, all these acetylcholine molecules, the neurotransmitters, would be released into this gap. The gap is called synaptic cleft. So neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitters move across the synaptic cleft to the postsynaptic membrane. This is the postsynaptic membrane. Now the postsynaptic membrane has these special receptors for the neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters or acetylcholine molecules are going to bind here, and as they bind here, the channels would open. Now these channels, the calcium channels, because they were stimulated by the electrical impulse. See, I told you that they are stimulated by the electrical impulse that is traveling in the sensory neuron. So because they are stimulated by the electrical impulse, these channels are called voltage gated channels. So calcium channels that open in the presynaptic neurons are actually voltage gated channels. But these channels, they are stimulated by a chemical. A chemical, acetylcholine, binds here that opens these channels, not the electrical impulse. So chemical is also called ligand. So we are going to call them the ligand gated channels. But these channels are for sodium ions. The previous channels in the presynaptic neurons were for calcium ions that open because of the electrical impulse. Calcium ions get in, they cause the vesicles to move, vesicles merge with the presynaptic membrane, release the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitters bind to their specific receptors, complementary receptors, onto the postsynaptic membrane. As the neurotransmitters, the acetylcholine molecules, bind here, they would open the ligand gated sodium channels. Now sodium gets in, and as the sodium gets into the postsynaptic neuron, sodium would cause the electrical impulse to be initiated in the next neuron. Again, the electrical impulse. So it was an electrical impulse as it was traveling in the sensory neuron, but when it reaches the very end of the presynaptic neuron, it becomes a chemical impulse. This part is where it is the chemical impulse because it is being transmitted by the chemicals, the neurotransmitters. There it is electrical. But as the sodium channels open here, the sodium ions get in into the postsynaptic neuron. This becomes the electrical impulse again. Now this electrical impulse would be carried to your central nervous system. All of the details are given here. You can turn on your mic now and tell me if you understand this process.
Yeah, I understand it.